Alrighty, so, hi everybody, glad you all could make it. In the way of announcements, one, real quick, Kevin, how was Saturday?
Okay, so Saturday, a group of us went to the ICR's their archaeology conference, and so that was, they gave a series of 4 talks covering different aspects of biblical archaeology and evidence for especially Old Testament archaeology, covering evidence for like the biblical accounts of Joshua and Judges, and it was a good time. We had, the speakers were obviously very very knowledgeable on the subject. There was even some. Even for those of us who kind of were somewhat had a baseline level of familiarity with the subject, there was still like some new information there too, like evidence of like pottery samples found around Jericho that kind of line up, that kind of helped solidify the date of the conquest of Canaan, kind of around where we would expect it to be. And I'm glad that at least a couple people were able to make it out.
Yeah.
I did talk to Titus Kennedy was one of the archaeologists presenting, and apparently he's teaching at DTS some. He doesn't live in the area, but he comes in to do that teaching every so often, and he seems open to possibly coming here and giving a talk at UT Dallas sometime. That would be an ideal thing to like combine with Focus and or BSM or whatever. And
yeah, he should be in the area often enough that something like that could happen.
yeah.
Alright, well cool. So, in the way of other announcements, this weekend we have nothing going on. Yay, first time today. The next weekend, Friday the 21st, I believe, is our annual Janksgiving. So this is our Thanksgiving celebration where we basically just have a Thanksgiving potluck, which ideally is supposed to be made of like the cheapest, jankiest food we can find because we're all college students and we're
college students to bring whatever they have on hand.
Yep.
Like it doesn't.
Or they can buy from Walmart cheaply.
It's not intended to be like a full Thanksgiving meal, but if it happens to turn into that, that's perfectly fine too.
The game has been up since the earlier versions of it. It seems like it's, but we didn't want to burden students with having to bring anything expensive.
But yeah, so that we're going to try to have that on the Friday before Thanksgiving. I'll probably send out an announcement like really soon, honestly, to get people knowing about that, and I'll get the sign-up sheet for like different food items. That would be good to have there. So other than that, that should be like our last weekend event, our last official weekend event for a while, because with finals and stuff, we probably won't have pancakes.
Yeah, we'll have the end of semester party
we'll
that'll be like our last Tuesday meeting, and then that'll just be it for the semester.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty, then I will leave it over to Alan.
Okay. All right. So last week we had Justin Bass here talking about the impact of Jesus, and this was sort of a fill-in. We originally had someone else that was going to give a talk, and we kind of shuffled the schedule around. But this is a talk I gave at my church a while back that I tweaked just a tiny bit. So it also, I think, ties in a little bit with last week, but more looking at who did Jesus claim to be? Does the Orthodox Christian view really right that he really did claim to be God? How does that tie into the Old Testament? What about objections related to those kinds of things? What do the skeptics say looking at those issues? So probably jump around a little bit. We have a small group here. Appreciate you guests being here. Welcome. And we can kind of tailor it, dive in deeper on whatever you guys wanted to really talk about within this. So so here's the outline that I just mentioned. One thing that bothers some people are like, well, wow, if Jesus was really God, why isn't it more blatantly obvious in the New Testament? We'll try to deal with that objection. And we'll look at what is the earliest evidence about people that were following Jesus. How does that relate to this? We'll talk about the famous Lord Liar Lunatic Trilemma that C.S. Lewis didn't invent, but sort of made famous. and look at the continuity, like, wait a minute, isn't this Jesus portraying himself different than Old Testament messianic expectations as an objection? And if we have time, we might talk about the potentially intolerant nature of the view that Jesus is the only way to God. That could come up often in conversations. So let's start here with Jesus, the historical record we have about Jesus and what did he really claim. We'll start off with a nice little short video and then discuss it here.
Third, Jesus claimed to be the Son of Man. This was Jesus' favourite self-designation, being used some 80 times in the Gospels. This has convinced the vast majority of New Testament historians that Jesus did, in fact, think of himself as the Son of Man. Notice, not just a Son of Man, but the Son of Man. Jesus was directing our attention to a vision described by the prophet Daniel. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. At Jesus' trial, the Jewish high priest accused Jesus. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? His answer left no room for doubt. I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. By applying all three of these titles to himself, Jesus was claiming in no uncertain terms that he was the very God his accusers worshipped. It's no surprise the Jewish court charged him with blasphemy and condemned him to death. But that's not all. New Testament historians are agreed that the historical Jesus also claimed to have divine power and authority to perform miracles, cast out demons, revise Old Testament law, and forgive sins. He even went so far as to claim that everyone's eternal destiny is determined solely by whether we believe in him.
All right, this is put out by Reasonable Faith, by the way, on their YouTube channel. You can find these short animated videos like this. I thought that was pretty good, kind of summarizing some of the things that we could delve into more deeply here. So why wasn't Jesus clearer about his identity? We do have examples in the New Testament where Jesus told people not to say who he was. So we could talk about why that is in a minute, but just to give you the examples. So like Jesus told the demon in Mark 1 to stop saying he's the Holy One of God. After he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, he gave strict orders that no one should know about this. Mark 5. And then after Peter said he's the Christ, in that famous passage where, he's asking this very question we're talking about today, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Peter gets it right, but then Jesus warns the disciples to tell no one. So let's just talk about that. I want to hear what you guys think about that. Why wouldn't Jesus necessarily be clearer about his identity?
Spitballing. I don't have a good reason for this, but I'm guessing perhaps it had to do with the fact that faith is the crux of his whole system. It's the core of how he finds believers in him. And you can't have faith if there's evidence proving it.
Okay. What do you think, Kevin? What else?
Well, considering that he was put to death for his, in part for his claim to divinity, it could be that he didn't want the word getting out until it was time for him to die.
Okay, yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it, for sure, yeah.
Wasn't everyone expecting like a military messiah or something? So
Yeah.
maybe we get in trouble immediately with the Romans.
Exactly, yeah. Y'all are hitting on the key answers here, I think. Did you have something to add, Robert, or
I was going to say
what Kevin said? Okay. Yeah, I think those are some of the main things. Yeah, I think if you really think clearly about the context that he was operating in, it would have led to a lot of major issues if he just came out. Plus, I think it probably would have been hard to accept, right? If from day one you go into this Jewish monotheistic culture saying, hey guys, by the way, I'm God. I'd be like, they think you're crazy. Much better if you did these amazing miracles and gradually led them to that. So here's the point that Andrew raised. I mean, the Romans, they knew about the Jews. They knew about people they're controlling in these different territories. They would have understood that most Jews expected a Messiah who would come in as one who would, kind of bring freedom, even political freedom. And that would have been something that would have really gotten on the radar in a hurry. And then if Jesus dies too soon, how can he have a life that's an example for us? And he's got purposes for building disciples and things. So we see we do see even in John 6:15, it mentions this after the feeding of the 5,000, where it says, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king after he did this amazing miracle, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Okay, so he was trying to keep enough of a low profile to avoid some of these problems, especially early on. And then all the more, I think, about Jesus revealing that he's God, or at least that's the contention I would hold, that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. And so there again, because the Jews, although as we'll see, I think there was some hints or some understanding among Jews that perhaps the Messiah would be God, but that wasn't widely known or expected necessarily. And so it would have been seen as blasphemy, as it later was actually. All right, yeah, so we kind of covered that. And then in 1 Corinthians 2, it also, I think, kind of affirms this common sense thing that you guys are saying, where it says, we speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden, and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So in that sense, even, it had to be a secret. Like if he was too bold in showing like he's God, like just totally took the veil off, he wouldn't have even been crucified and wouldn't have been able to die for our sins, according to that verse. So that might help some, with people looking at the New Testament and trying to evaluate, did Jesus really think he was God? Did he claim he was God? When you start factoring in how he would have needed to sort of reveal that over time. All right, so I think too in Scripture you see in the New Testament that Jesus eventually did reveal himself fully once he was ready to die. So like Mark, the last chapters 11 through 16 are all in the last basically week of Jesus' life. And that's where you see the triumphal entry, where he comes in on the donkey to fulfill a prophecy that the Messiah would come on a donkey. And then there also, he started telling parables more directly, like the vine growers, where it was basically, this was the one where they were killing all the people. Like this was an analogy of how God sent prophets in the Old Testament and they would like kill them or whatever and resist it. And then finally he sends his son and they kill him. And Jesus is saying, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And sure enough, obviously that did happen. And so there you can see that he's revealing himself as the Son of God. He was the beloved son who the vine growers killed. All right, and in that video we were discussing, it discussed this aspect. Jesus' favorite self-designation was the Son of Man, not a Son of Man. And it's interesting that the early church really didn't call him this. Other people, it was really more of just the Gospels who were trying to record Jesus' own words. They would say, yeah, this is what he basically called himself most of the time. And then the question is, well, how do you interpret that? And there is this reference that ties into Daniel 7, as was mentioned in that video. But I think the key thing is that Jesus himself at his trial tied it into this by quoting some of the actual parts of it. And so he's saying, yes, this is what I meant this whole time. I am the Son of Man who's coming in the cloud. So here's the verse. It was read before. Won't read it again here, but just highlighting in the Old Testament, only God would come with the clouds. And so this is a divine being, but he's like a son of man. So that's where you're seeing the humanity and divinity come together. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, that would be God the Father, and presented before him. And he's given dominion, glory, and a kingdom. People are serving him forever. His dominion is everlasting. So these are basically things that would only be appropriate if Jesus really was the Son of God, God himself. All right, so these are the points I've made. There's also in Daniel 2, where these visions of future kingdoms, you see that the one that replaces the Roman Empire is this lasting kingdom that is basically, Jesus said, look, I'm bringing you this kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. This is the long-lasting kingdom that was going to replace sort of the Roman Empire. But it was far less political than people realized. It wasn't this political movement, but it was more of affecting people sort of at the grassroots level, I would say. And so, yeah, the fact that he quotes this at the trial is really significant to really show that, yes, when he said Son of Man, he was referring to Daniel 7, which the Jews of the time, we know from ancient Jewish writings, they did see that as a divine figure. They may not have understood exactly how to interpret it, but that was seen as a divine being. And clearly, once he did that, the high priest said, this is blasphemy, just like it was mentioned in that video. The other thing to realize in Scripture is that even though Jesus didn't want to publicly make himself known necessarily as the Messiah or the Son of God early in his ministry, he did to his trusted disciples reveal his nature. All right, and there was actually quite a few things that Jesus did that really showed that he thought of himself as God. For example, and John does, I think, bring this out the clearest. Most people think that the Gospel of John was the last one written. And it may well be that John, being one of the inner circle of the three, he was with Jesus sometimes when other disciples weren't around. And he was trying to fill in more gaps that the other Gospels didn't necessarily cover everything about Jesus. And maybe at his time, the audience needed to hear more that, yeah, Jesus is God. Now, actually, there's a really good case, though, in Mark. There's a good video by Wes Huff online, if you want to look at that, where like every chapter in the book of Mark, he makes a case for how Jesus is revealing himself as God, or Mark is at least making the claim that Jesus thought of himself as God and revealed himself as God in basically every chapter of the book. Well, it's pretty well done. So it definitely isn't just John, but we can admit that there's more of a focus on Jesus as God in the book of John. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not elsewhere. It's just there's more time spent on making that case for whatever reason. Speaking of Mark, in Mark 9, it says, Jesus said, whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. He really is tying himself closely with the Father. Many times in the different Gospels, he accepts worship without rebuke. We see it in Matthew, where the disciples in the boat worship Jesus. The man with the unclean spirit ran to Jesus and worshiped him. In Luke, he ascended into heaven, and the disciples worshiped him as he was departing in his final departure from earth there. And the blind man who was cured in John 9 also worshiped him. All right, so there you have one from each gospel. And I could have given more, but I just wanted to kind of show like, hey, yeah, there's one in every gospel of that type. And nowhere in there do you see, like what you see in Acts, when people tried to say Paul and Barnabas were gods, they tore their clothes, ran off the stage and said, no, we're just mere men. But with Jesus, you don't see him denying it. So that's very significant. And there are places where he did directly claim to be God, or people writing about him at least thought of him that way. The people that were the early followers that had the best information about who he was and what he claimed certainly seemed to say that he was God. All right, so Matthew 1 talks about, it's just quoting from Isaiah there, the virgin will be a child, she'll bear a son, his name will be called Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. So this child, in some sense, was God. That's the mystery of the incarnation. Jesus coming as a human, adding a human nature to his divinity as the second person of the Trinity. All right. You also see in Luke there, a great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people. John 1 is very clear. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. All things came to being through him. Apart from him, nothing was made that has been made. Other places in John, Jesus calls God his own Father, making himself equal with God. It's very explicit. I and the Father are one, John 10. And then they were going to stone him, and they say, yeah, for good work we don't stone you, but for blasphemy. So yeah, there's so many passages in John, but there are ones elsewhere. And why was it the disciples tended to worship him? They were the ones with the close information. They knew that he thought of himself as God and that he was God. He proved it through his miracles, in their thinking at least, you could argue. And then if you look at what does God do in the Old Testament, you've got this really powerful case when you put it together of the things that only God could be said to do in the Old Testament, you see Jesus doing in the New Testament, and therefore demonstrating these God. Who's the Lord of the Sabbath? Jesus says that he is, whereas in Genesis 2, God is the Lord of the Sabbath. Who is the great I am? This name that God gave Moses at the burning bush. Jesus says that he is I am. Who is the only creator? John 1 that I just quoted says that Jesus was involved in the creation, just as Isaiah 44 says that, it's only God. Who will judge the sheep and the goats? Matthew fulfills Ezekiel. Who sent the prophets? Matthew is fulfilling Jeremiah 7 there. One of the interesting ones too is the Jeremiah 17 talks about God as the fountain of living waters, and then you see Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman in John 4, saying that that he is the fountain of living waters. Drink of this, and you'll never thirst again. Things like that. Who resurrects the dead? Only God. And then it is Jesus who gives rewards to man. Who has all authority and power? And that ties into Daniel as well, by the way. And then who forgives sin? Matthew and 2 Chronicles. So all these things, I think, show that Jesus is really making a case to the Jews who knew the Old Testament really well, that he's got the acts of God, he's got the names of God, the attributes. He's doing it over a period of time, though, and doing it and associated with miracles and things like that to make that case known, as opposed to just starting off with the verbal only and then coming back later and trying to demonstrate it. He wanted to demonstrate it as he goes there, I think. All right. At other points in our group, we've talked about sort of early secular sources about Jesus. I've talked about Tacitus and Josephus and so forth, but we could add a little bit more in terms of just archaeology. Some of this will overlap a little bit as well, but we'll go through it pretty quickly, and not everyone was there. But some of the earliest things that we have about Jesus in archaeology are very associated with Jesus being worshipped. So there's this drawing on this rock near Rome that's dated to the late 100s, the Alexamenos graffito. It's just sort of some graffiti. It's been redrawn there so you can see it a little bit better of what it was, but it's like a donkey on a cross, and there's somebody there. It was drawn by a Roman soldier to mock a fellow soldier who was a Christian. And basically it's showing this man standing by a crucifixion victim saying, Alexamenos worships his God. So there's this Christian soldier that worshiped Jesus, and this other guy is just like making fun of him for worshiping someone that was crucified, which, as the Bible says, the cross is a stumbling block to the Romans, especially being associated with power. It just seemed really weird, like you were crucified, that's really a sign of weakness. And so it was something that led to mockery. So if you look at the very earliest church building that we have, now it's not as early as we would want at this point, but maybe we'll find earlier ones. but a lot of it was early house churches. There was some persecution and so forth that made it difficult to build a lot of things for quite a while. But I think it is significant that many of the earliest things of any type that you find will acknowledge Jesus as being worshipped. So this one from the early 200s has a prayer hall containing the inscription that Agapetus, a woman, the God-loving, offered this table for the God Jesus Christ as a remembrance. All right, and we do have some of these very clear statements. One of the more famous ones is John 14:6 here, where Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And so I think we are challenged, all of us, with what are we going to do with Jesus? How are we going to respond to this, claim? And Pilate said, then what shall I do with the one who's called Christ? He kind of didn't want to crucify him, but he wanted to placate the people and so forth. And so we might all want to avoid making a decision ourselves, but you have to make a decision. If you make no decision, that itself is a decision, so to speak. Sort of like if you had cancer and you did nothing, that's a decision itself, that you're not fighting the cancer. So what are the options? Here, let's think about this Lord, liar, lunatic. Now, sometimes skeptics will kind of give that a hard time. They'll say, well, that's a false trilemma. There's other options like maybe legend. And that's worth talking about a little bit. But if you realize the context of C.S. Lewis giving this in, maybe 1940 or something, first of all, as an expert in ancient history, ancient literature, he viewed it as completely implausible, the option that Jesus was just a legend. So that was just sort of off the table on an evidential basis because we have so many writings from so many different Christian, Jewish, Roman sources that would affirm that there was this real person, Jesus, and he had the certain, at least basic attributes you could affirm, even if you approach the historical record with a very skeptical mindset. And so he really wanted then to force people to think about the three options that Jesus would leave us with. He said in Mere Christianity, it's foolish to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but not to accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man what is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. All right, so let's unpack that a little bit. I think he's basically saying, look, if Jesus knew he wasn't God, that's one option, right? But he was claiming to be, that would make him a liar of a pretty bad sort. And yet you do have people like Peter, in writing in his first Peter letter, he says that Jesus committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. His followers didn't think of him as the type person that lied. He seemed to be a morally great person with great moral teachings, like love your enemies. Justin even mentioned some of those last week in terms of the impact they've had around the world over many different cultures in helping people to recognize the value of all humans and that all humans have dignity, things like that. And so it seems a little odd to say, well, Jesus was just this liar. It doesn't seem to fit. How could he have this incredible impact if he was really just a lying hypocrite? Okay, but you do have another option too. Jesus thought he was God, but wasn't. Maybe he was sincerely deluded, so he wasn't a liar. He really thought this, but he was just wrong. All right, so, this is, though, a very radical claim to claim you're God, especially in this kind of Jewish context where they're fiercely monotheistic. But, at least the people, how would he start this movement if he's basically like a lunatic? Would he really have the kind of character, fortitude to have this kind of impact? That you have these disciples that live with him, went around, they knew him well. He seemed to be more of a rational, patient person. He forgave the people that crucified him on the cross, things like that. He had this radical level of love and compassion on people. He did sometimes, he got angry and turned over the tables for people that were trying to make money off of church things. That was seemingly righteous anger, though. But he never really showed signs of being deluded or mentally disturbed. So if you get rid of those options, though, I mean, the only really other option that's plausible, we've already sort of mentioned that legend doesn't seem to be a good option either, is that Jesus was God, just as he claimed to be. The historical difficulty of giving for the life, sayings, and influence of Jesus any explanation that is not harder than the Christian explanation is very great. So you can kind of craft a story saying that he was a liar or he was a lunatic. Most people don't want to put it in those terms, but that's kind of what it boils down to effectively. But it really doesn't fit the overall evidence we have about Jesus' life and his impact and his character. And remember, it wasn't like he was just going around occasionally speaking once a week. These disciples were living with him for more than a year. They knew him well. They knew his character. So it would have been hard to just kind of deceive everybody for that long a period of time. That was really multiple years. All right, I talked about the legend thing already. Any comments on this? Yeah.
I was going to say that it is interesting that we don't have, I don't know, some place in like the letters or the Gospels or, some place where we have one of the disciples or something saying stuff about Jesus where he's doing something that looks, morally bad or just strange or just, I don't know, something like thinking he's crazy or something like that.
Yeah.
I say this because I'd argue there's quite a contrast between this and what we find in like Islam.
Yeah.
Don't have any, actually, that is interesting. We don't have anything where Jesus thinks he is crazy or he is demon possessed, whereas we have Muhammad thinking he is crazy and demon possessed and tries to throw himself off a cliff until Jibreel tells him not to. So,
Yeah, there's some pretty wild stories. Yeah.
So it's interesting.
That is interesting. Robert.
Although I guess to add on to that a little bit, like, say he was a lunatic, right? Say he like was well acquainted with the scriptures and like, I think there's some passages that sort of like allude to like the resurrection and things like that, or dying on the cross. So say like was a lunatic, wouldn't he still like, with that thought, wouldn't he act kind of like how he did? Like I feel like it's not like a terrible case you could make. I mean, you'd have to explain like the miracles and all that. But
If he's trying to deceive people, he would be on his best behavior, so to speak.
or like
For that might fit the liar to me more, but you're saying like if he was sincerely
yeah,
deceived?
he sincerely thought he was God.
Okay.
Like, oh, I'm God, and God has these teachings, or like this like
Okay.
things are all worth have a certain. Like,
He would also, that's also, yeah, he would try to sort of be on his best behavior or best example. Or,
I have kind of 2 points on that. Interesting thought. First, on the case of lunatic, there's so much, and there's so many case studies, which I get they're case studies. You can't take them as, full on granted evidence, but of how our minds kind of make our reality. The case in point, the leading case being the placebo effect. How we believe the sugar pill is a real thing and our body will all of a sudden heal itself. But
Yeah.
there are cases of kind of crazy extents of that. So like if he were a lunatic, he might have like kind of wild abilities like some quote unquote like psychics might have, where they can actually detect things that would not be perceivable to most people. But I don't think it would give you the power to bring back the dead. But that could be a thing if he were also, if a lunatic faded into legend, kind of, if it were a morph of those two. But I think on the note of legend, it seems to me that he accrued too much mass following too quickly for it to just be legend. Unless, does anyone know of a case where kind of that has happened? Like when people start cults, or like when the Latter-day Saints religion was created, it's kind of a slower burn, slower build over time, whereas his was kind of all at once right now.
it's a good
Does
point.
anyone know of a case where that's happened that quickly for any other religion?
I think too, you want to look at like, the early Mormon movement, they had an army, and they had all, these different elements of power, whereas Jesus really didn't. He wasn't an author. He didn't have political power. He didn't have. I mean, he wasn't accepted either by the Jewish religious leaders. He had none of the things that would sort of help you quickly establish some strong movement, which itself, I think, speaks to, well, there must be something significant there that.
And a lot of times he actually withdrew from those things, like being a public figurehead at certain times. Like at one point, he would actually get away from it. And perform miracles in secret. Things like that.
There is a classical expert, A.N. Sherwin-White, who sometimes I know Dr. Craig will quote from him, where apparently he's an expert in like looking at different ancient figures, and he says that usually it's like a couple of generations for legends to form. And he's making the argument as a non-Christian of like, yeah, there's too much here for legendary development. It doesn't seem to fit. And yeah, if we had more evidence of like early things where people were not saying Jesus is God, yeah, you have a few people, you have these different heresies coming about, but most of that comes later. In fact, the earliest heresy was more of like Docetism, Jesus is God only. And later it was like the Arianism came later, like, no, he's just a created being. So it's kind of interesting to look at that. I think, yeah, you want to look at that early evidence, and there's something very unique happening here historically.
Yeah, I guess one question is to expand on that, like how you were talking before about the Gospel of John. Seems like it's kind of like more focused on that, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
do we have any ideas on like maybe why he was so focused on like?
Most scholars do think that he would have been aware of the other three Gospels, and so he may have been trying to make sure people were understanding the divine claims. And maybe something like Mark came out right away, was written hurriedly. Some of the things, it doesn't even mention people by name, because it's like they didn't want people to know that Peter was the one that cut off Malchus's ear because they might go after her. There's some interesting tidbits of like Mark was written hurriedly, and people like Luke said he wanted to write an orderly account because maybe Mark's wasn't. And Mark's almost seems to be more of like he wants people to see Jesus as Jesus presented himself over time, and let people kind of come to that understanding about Jesus as God in the same kind of way that they did as people that were following Jesus. There could be something there. And then you also have, like I mentioned, John as one of the inner circle of three, Peter, James, and John. He would have been privy to some of the things like the transfiguration and whatever that others weren't. And so there might be, he probably heard some of the claims of divinity before other disciples would have, I would think, things like that as well. He might, that's why John maybe is saying some of the I am statements.
Yeah, I feel like what's usually pointed to with John as being like higher Christology is a lot of, direct references of, more direct references of, Jesus making I am statements, saying he was there before Abraham, comparing himself directly with God. But I feel like you still have, even if we go to Mark, say, okay, Mark's the earliest gospel, whatever. The first verse in Mark mentions Son of God.
That's exactly right,
so maybe you could argue this thing of, Jesus being equal to God was this later development, but he was, you still can't really get around the fact that he was the Son of God, and so the question is, what does that mean? And I feel like a lot of people say he didn't claim to be God, but they don't really keep going with that to actually okay, then what model are you proposing? Are you proposing that he thought he was a demigod of some sort, that he was the Son of God but wasn't quite you're proposing Arianism or something like that? Maybe that could be something that's floated, but I feel like I don't see that very often. It's just, he didn't claim to be God initially, checkmate.
Yeah, Mark has, he's walking on water, which Old Testament only God would do, and forgiving of sins. You have all of that in Mark.
So, if he wasn't God in Mark, then what really was he?
Yeah, and in response to a lot of the things that Jesus either does or says that are referring to attributes of God that the Old Testament refers to, you have the crowd saying things like, "Who is this man who claims to forgive sins?" For example, where it's like there's an understanding in the text that Jesus is saying something that normal people don't claim, and for a predominantly Jewish audience who knows that these are attributes of God or things that only God can do, the answer to that rhetorical question is pretty obvious.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, he never denied it and said, no, I just meant God forgave the sin of this person I healed. He just lets it go with, he's saying, I forgive your sins. So he's like, he is making himself known, but he's given people time to kind of unpack what that really means and confirm it with the miracles.
So it could be that John, maybe one of the motivations for making it more clear or just more explicit is that as Christianity spreads to an audience that maybe doesn't have the same level of familiarity with the scriptures that
Yeah,
that the first
that's a good point.
would have had, that maybe some of these things do need to be made more clear as Christianity spreads to a wider set of cultures.
Yeah, we know John spent a lot of time at Ephesus, and he was in these areas further away, and would have been right if he really did write it in like a 90, which a lot of people think. Then, Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem, and the people were spread out, and the church, Christianity had spread quite a bit by that point. So that's a good point, Kevin. That is probably one of the key reasons. All right, now what about this? So some would say, well, the Old Testament conveys a Messiah that's not divine, and it seems to just be one person, monotheism that doesn't really explicitly say there's more than one person in the Godhead or things like that. How do we respond to some of those objections? Okay, so here I think that I would agree that, like a lot of things in the Old Testament, it's not as clear as the New Testament, but you would expect that, right? If God's coming down as a human and revealing himself in this very substantial way, you're going to really learn all the details about that only when he's here. You can't expect it to be as explicit. But I do think in the Old Testament we see examples where, sometimes it'll talk about an angel of the Lord coming that seems to be God in human form if you really look at the text carefully. And you should note that the Hebrew word for angel really just means messenger. So it's ambiguous, like who is the messenger? Is it just an angel? Is it Jesus incarnate in some form coming before he was incarnate on earth, or what? But one of the interesting passages people have pointed out is in Genesis 16, where you have Hagar running away from Sarai. Okay, so remember that Abram, who became Abraham, married Sarah, and they had the promise of your son is going to, be the heir. But they got impatient because it was taking forever. Hagar had Ishmael, and so then you had some conflict between those two. And so Hagar is running away from Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." All right, so we have the angel of the Lord being spoken of as the giver of life. I will surely multiply your offspring. It doesn't say, look, I'm this messenger sent. God's going to do this. It's more of just like, hey, I'm going to multiply your offspring. And yes, by the way, notice that Ishmael was going to become a great nation as well, a great number of people, which has certainly come true as well. Hagar thinks she's seeing God himself. She says, "You are God." All right, so in this case, this angel of the Lord does seem to be God himself, which is quite interesting. All right, another example, and here it's even more clear that it's like you see the two persons aspect. Zechariah 2, "For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Behold, I will shake my hand over them, and they shall become plunder for those who served him. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. Sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come and I will dwell in your midst, declared the Lord. So you have the Lord being sent by the Lord, Yahweh being sent by Yahweh. So that seems to be two persons, one God. All right, so that's kind of interesting as well. And there's more. There's another passage, and there's more that I'm not even getting to. But admittedly, again, it's not as explicit, obviously, as the New Testament, where you have Jesus there praying to God. Obviously, that's going to be more clear than what you might see in the Old Testament when Jesus is actually there. But Isaiah 48 says, the Lord is speaking and says, the Lord has sent me in his spirit. I am the first, I am the last. My hand laid the foundation of the earth. My right hand spread out the heavens. That sounds like God, right? But then it goes on to say, draw near to me, hear this from the beginning. I have not spoken in secret. From the time it came to be, I have been there. And now the Lord God has sent me and his spirit. Wait a minute. I thought God was already talking. And now we have the Lord God sending me and his spirit. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord your God who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the way you should go. Oh, that you had paid attention to my commandments. So read through that sometime and see if you don't see there, I think even, because it mentions the spirit, it's somewhat of a hint towards the Trinity in the Old Testament, I believe. Okay, so some might say, well, wait a minute, Jews really don't ever seem to talk about this stuff. You Christians are just reading it back into the text. But actually, that also is a misconception. They're actually, if you look at ancient Jewish writings, you see that they did notice these verses and talked about them in very similar ways to what I just did. So here's 3 different books by 3 different Jewish non-Christian scholars that talk about how in the Old Testament it affirms multiple persons in God and how this was a characteristic belief in early Judaism. I'm not saying it was universal and things like that. I'm just saying there was a significant element of Jews that saw those verses and really grappled with the fact that this seems to be more than one person, yet they were certainly clear that they believed in one God, right? From Deuteronomy 6 and all, there's just one God, but they seem to see that there's something going on here with the multiple persons aspect. So UC Berkeley professor Daniel Boyarin, in his book, The Jewish Gospels, provides compelling evidence that the Trinitarian, or at least binitarian, notion of God had deep roots in Jewish history, virtually from its beginnings. All right, and then here's a little snippet of one of them talking about this.
If you study early Jewish writings, you will see that many authors wrestled with the idea of 3 powers in the
This is Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, but
in the past, we looked at several of these passages and demonstrated how the Trinity doctrine was not an invention of the New Testament, but was taught overwhelmingly throughout the Old Testament as well. Many ancient Jews and Jewish scholars today have recognized this, like Jewish scholar Benjamin Sommer.
This is actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea that is an old Semitic idea that is popping up again among those Jews who were the founders of Christianity. And we Jews have always tended to sort of make fun of the Trinity. Oh, how can there be 3 that is 1? Really, they're pagans. They're not real monotheists like we Jews are, or like the Muslims are. Those Christians are really pagan. But I think that what we're seeing from what I've been saying in the past couple days is that, the idea of the Trinity, that there is this one God who manifests itself in 3 different ways, that's actually an old ancient Near Eastern idea.
so yeah, there's one Jewish scholar kind of confirming what I was just claiming there. All right, and then also specifically about the Messiah, and this is something I was studying just this week for some other reason, but I was realizing there's a lot more passages where it's talking about the Messiah the Jews expected that really hints at or even directly seems to be saying that Messiah would be God than I previously realized. So again, I'm listing not all of the verses, but I'll give you a brief synopsis. How are we doing on time, by the way? Because I didn't bring my phone in from the car. Okay. Yeah, we can maybe just go through this and have a brief discussion. We'll wrap it up. All right, so Zechariah 12, where God is speaking, he says, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced. All right, the fact that God is speaking and he's saying that he's going to be the one pierced, that sounds like, also what we see in Isaiah 53, the suffering servant that would be, and especially also, I guess, in Psalms 22, where it's talking about, it sounds a lot like a crucifixion, even before crucifixion existed. So that there seems to be a tie-in here between this kind of suffering servant version of the Messiah and God himself, which is really interesting. And then, of course, at Christmas time, we hear Emmanuel, God with us, and so forth. But yeah, just remember what that means, as we mentioned even earlier from Matthew drawing it out. When the virgin is said to going to bear a son, his name is going to be God with us. And then Isaiah 9 also says that the child to be born, and this one is even more clearly messianic than Isaiah 7 is, but he's going to be called the mighty God, among other things. So that child is in some sense God. And then you have in Isaiah 40, where he's explaining how God is pardoning the iniquity of the people. And he talks about a voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight a desert, a highway for our God. It's very explicitly talking about God. That is quoted in Mark 1, again, Mark pointing to the divinity of Jesus and saying, look, when John the Baptist came, he tied himself into this very passage in Isaiah 40. And that one was explicitly saying that it's God coming, not just like a prophet of God or something, but it's really God. And so that also has tying in the Messiah to God. We've already talked about Daniel 7, but that's one of the clearest ones where this Son of Man figure, this future figure, maybe you could argue maybe it's not as clearly the Messiah there, but it's clearly a divine figure that was going to be very significant in future history. And we know, actually, some of my research recently, I was looking at how Jews writing in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this Essene community that existed before the time of Christ and overlapping a little bit beyond his death. But we have writings very early then, before Jesus, even saying, look, Psalms 45 was viewed as messianic. In that psalm, it says things like, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You have loved righteousness, hated wickedness. It's really seems to be speaking of that messianic figure in Psalm 45 as divine. And it's certainly what Hebrews claims, but again, of course, you could argue maybe the Christians are reading that back into the text. But when you find this kind of independent evidence showing that Jews, before Jesus was even known or lived, were viewing that psalm that way, that's pretty good evidence that there was at least some understanding that the Messiah might be divine. So yeah, I think that's probably a good stopping point to just kind of discuss and wrap it up here. Any thoughts on any of that? Trinity of the Old Testament, Messiah having some hints of being divine. Andrew?
I've talked with some Muslim people, and they believe in Jesus to some extent.
Right.
I mean, they believe in him as like a man,
Prophet.
not as a God.
Right.
But they seem to, I guess they believe that he did not claim to be God in general. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a prophet if he was falsely claiming to be God.
They end up having to say, well, we think those texts have been changed and things like that. Because otherwise, yeah, they're in this awkward situation of, wait a minute, you're saying he's this prophet, but you can't also be saying that he's lying about being God and things like that. So.
Yes. And one of them, they pointed me to like an early Christian sect that didn't, that believed that that Jesus was just a man. That, I don't know.
Probably, yeah.
He said that there was sects of Christianity early that didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus.
There was some, and I would argue they weren't necessarily like they weren't the earliest, because the earliest were like the disciples and the followers, and you've got even like Pliny writing just after 100 in Turkey about how Christians were worshiping God, and it's also in Tacitus and Suetonius implying that. But Seth, what do you have to add to that?
So yeah, they believe that Jesus was a prophet, was an Islamic prophet specifically, and that he taught Islam and true monotheism. They do believe he was the Messiah, but know that he never claimed that he was God, that he was given the Injil, the gospel, that this was an actual book that was given to him, revelation that was given to him, not just people writing stuff down, and that this over time got corrupted into the gospels we have today. But the problem is, even if we say that in the arguments that there was some kind of sect of Christians back then that didn't believe he was God and was more aligned with like the Muslim beliefs that they expect the disciples to have, those arguments are very flawed. But even if we grant that, a big problem that they still have is the fact that the Quran really makes it seem like the gospel at the time of Muhammad in the 600s AD was that Injil that was given to Jesus that taught like Islam, but we have gospels and Bibles like, you know, a Codex Vaticanus or whatever from before 600 AD that very clearly, you know, are the Bibles we have today that don't match up at all with what they claim.
But they believe that there's a gospel that preceded these gospels, or that came before.
They can't affirm the gospel as we have it today, but yeah, Seth's point is like, well, the other thing is that even in the Quran, it talks about like go to the people of the book and learn from them. It seemed to be some.
The gospel were given to humanity as a guidance and a light. It says, and so yeah, the Quran affirms the Torah and the gospel, but then also contradicts them. And so they have to get around it by saying, well, the Torah and the gospel have been changed, but there's no evidence of that. And this is known as the Islamic dilemma.
Well put, yeah.
Alan, what would distinguish early Christians who did not believe in Jesus' divinity from Jews?
There certainly were some Jews who, yeah, were in that camp, but there were some who would want to say Jesus was special. What was the dating of the Ebionites? Do you recall offhand?
I will look them up. I honestly don't know much about them. I just know they're cited as like...
The Muslims will reference them a lot, right? And
one, I think they were really small, and the only reason we know they exist was because one Christian wrote of like, yeah, these guys are because of this. But
yeah, you have some early Christian writings like Against Heresies by Irenaeus in the 2nd century, where he tries to go against a lot of the different false beliefs. And we know they were out there, and we know there were these Gnostic Gospels that came about, but they were more in the camp of like, oh yeah, Jesus was God, but they maybe would deny his humanity because they had a negative view of physical things and that kind of Greek influence culture. So you definitely had a few things floating around there, but if you look at the early followers and the early movement, there's really no evidence that they weren't worshiping Jesus as God.
so the earliest reference to a sect that might fit the description of the later Ebionites appears in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in 155 to 160 AD. And then Irenaeus is probably the first to use the term Ebionites in 212.
Okay.
So, this is a good deal after the Gospels.
That is quite safely late enough to back up what we're trying to say here.
Sorry. Irenaeus was 180. Origen
That's what I was thinking. Okay.
ends up marking something, mentioning something in 212. I get those mixed up.
Yeah. Still well later. But you're right, Connor. Like, yeah, there was plenty of Jews that didn't accept Jesus. Obviously, we see that in the New Testament. And they would have not thought of him as God, but they also probably wouldn't have called themselves Christians or Christ followers or whatever. So it wasn't like a sect of Christianity.
Any group like that still doesn't align with what the Muslims are trying to get out of.
Exactly. Yeah.
I do have a question on this is a little bit tangential to the point that's being made on this slide.
Okay.
But, the Isaiah 7:14. I've just heard a lot that the word virgin there is like a mistranslation. That like it was like
Yeah.
just a young woman.
There's a lot of discussion about that.
Ask if you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I did try to downplay, you notice. I said, well, Isaiah 9 is probably a better one to focus on. But I think there's a pretty good case that can be made that, but again, like a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament, sometimes it's talking about something that happened then, but also there's like a future version of that it's sort of a double, it's like a prophecy and it definitely seems to be in that camp, which can make it harder to say, well, do you know for sure this is even a prophecy? So I'm okay granting that to the skeptic and focusing on the other ones, but I think it is sort of in that camp, at least, though, of like, here's some possible indications of a divine Messiah that are worth considering anyway.
Prophecy of God incarnating on earth is much more important than prophecy of the miracle of the virgin birth. So, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, for our context, yeah.
So, I mean, the Jewish objection to Jesus, according to the Gospels, was that he claimed to be God, right? I guess in his trial?
Yeah, they were very much thinking like, oh, you're just blaspheming, you know.
Yeah.
They just rejected
But apparently
that.
they did have some concept that a human could be God already.
What I'm saying is that historically, Jews that were carefully looking at the Old Testament scriptures, the Tanakh, they were definitely seeing the same things that we're talking about here. Now, it's a different question of what about the Pharisees or I mean, the Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection. They didn't accept anything but the Torah. But the Pharisees were more of taking the whole Tanakh or Old Testament, and they would have, but you know, maybe they didn't think about those verses in that era. I couldn't answer that very, very well. But I think the point for us as Christians, though, is to say, well, look, these verses really are in the Old Testament. And anybody that really looked at them with an open mind and studying would at least see that the claims of Jesus are not totally out of left field in that respect.
They also didn't think Jesus was the Messiah either, and they certainly
Right.
expected the Messiah to come as a person.
Yeah,
So that wasn't, they still rejected that claim from him. So
yeah.
they just didn't think it was him.
And yet you also have, like in Malachi, it talks about how the Messiah would enter the temple, and so the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So that really limits, and if you're a Jew and you're really studying and looking through things carefully, that should really get your attention that the world's most famous Jew, Jesus, that had this huge impact, and he did go to the temple, and he lived before, like he could fulfill the things that were said about the Messiah, especially when you look at these other verses. But who else could even come close to fulfilling any of that? I think you are seeing more Jews come to Christ than you used to. For many centuries, there was almost none of them. After the initial growth was led by Jews, and there was a period of time where there just weren't very many. But it seems like in the last 50 years especially, I know a lot of Jews who are believers in Christ. So there's an interesting trend lines, from what I understand, in Israel as well, of more Jews turning to Christ than used to be, as well as more Muslims. But anyway, well, I guess we're sort of out of time.
I've really enjoyed it. I would love to keep talking. I have to get to the airport to pick someone up. Thank you
Okay,
very
perfect
much.
timing, and we're basically done. Yeah, good to meet you. Take care.
Nice to meet you.
Come back anytime.
Appreciate it.
What are the plans? You going out to eat tonight and stuff? And
I was thinking Whataburger. I don't think we've done that in a bit.
all right, anyone's welcome to join at Whataburger, and thank you guys for coming out.
What's the closest Whataburger?
There's two really close. There are two close. The one that we're going to